Today, we're going to learn about a little boy in India who, for a time, seemed like he was the worst behaved kid on the planet. But the truth was that this little boy had a huge secret, and when his secret got out, it changed everything anyone thought they knew about him. It prompted big-time college professors from major universities all around the world to personally fly to India to investigate this kid's claims because the implications of what he was saying were massive. But before we get into that story, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed, cradling her toddler son, whose name was Teetu, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. Teetu, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, it just seemed like Teetu was getting worse and worse by the second. Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like there was really nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. Teetu was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy, was fighting with his siblings, or something like that. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why Teetu was throwing this tantrum because he threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken Teetu to the local doctor, and he'd been examined. The doctor said, "Look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him, so whatever is causing him to be so upset has got to be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to calm him down, but as she did that, Teetu turned around and tried to hit her in the face. He kicked and punched her, so Shanti had to fall back on the bed. Teetu, still throwing this huge tantrum, leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, and her husband outside to wait out this current Teetu tantrum. For a second, Shanti thought about just lying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler run around the house until he was done throwing his tantrum. But as Shanti was lying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. She jumped up and ran into the kitchen, where she found Teetu looking down at the ground where a shattered plate lay. Clearly, Teetu had smashed it on purpose. As furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. So the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to Teetu, who was still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she came near him. She grabbed him, turned him around so he couldn't kick or punch her, put him into his room, and then shut the door. She sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. As Teetu inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti sat there anchoring the door and praying that her son would calm down soon. At some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. Teetu in the bedroom began saying the word Sesh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti, her husband, and the other kids had no idea what it meant. But, at the end of his tantrums, Teetu would always just start saying over and over again, Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma. Shanti, hearing Teetu start to do that, thought, okay, this tantrum is about to end. But she also thought, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. So Shanti began yelling through the door at Teetu to explain what Sesh Verma meant, but Teetu had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again, Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids, and Teetu was the youngest. Teetu was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this. Not at all. In fact, Teetu had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with Teetu, she had become very, very sick, and had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. Then, as a newborn baby, Teetu basically didn't sleep at all and cried constantly. So, Shanti and her husband initially thought Teetu must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that Teetu was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until Teetu began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. The things Teetu was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that Teetu would use during his temper tantrums, Sesh Verma. Basically, Teetu would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. For context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home. They didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes. Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat. They were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, above and beyond a modest life. Teetu had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all Teetu wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when Teetu's mom Shanti would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, Teetu would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. Teetu would also walk around their house and point to spots that looked dirty, demanding that someone clean them up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. Whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk or take the bus, Teetu would complain the entire time, saying that he wanted to be in a car and questioning why they weren't driving instead of walking, despite the fact that Teetu had basically never used a car before. Perhaps the strangest aspect of Teetu's behavior was that around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about the very historic city of Agra, located about 80 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but Teetu had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to it. His family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time Teetu began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. When his parents would say no, they weren't going to Agra, Teetu would throw a huge tantrum. So, not long after Teetu had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that all they could do was wait and hope their son would grow out of this terrible behavior. But Teetu did not grow out of it. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, Teetu randomly attacked another small child with a sugarcane, beating the child so badly that they were bleeding by the end of the attack. Not long after the sugarcane incident, Teetu was at the store with his mother. She was looking at a bracelet through the glass, one she couldn't afford, and Teetu, sensing his mother's desire for the bracelet, showed an odd display of affection. This little boy, not even 3 years old, turned to the shopkeeper and said that if he didn't give the bracelet to his mother for free, Teetu would shoot and kill him. After this, Shanti and her husband stopped taking Teetu out in public entirely. It was just too embarrassing. However, what unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was the nonsense word that Teetu kept saying at the end of all his tantrums. Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma. Fast forward to that day after he'd broken the plate and Shanti had put him in his room, Teetu began saying that nonsense word again. But now that he was getting a little older and his speech was clearer, Shanti realized her son wasn't saying a single word like Sesh Verma. He was actually saying 2 words, CS Verma. Shanti had no idea what it meant, though it sounded like a name. However, it was a name she had never heard before. A few months later, in April 1987, all of Teetu's strange, erratic, and terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to run some errands. Her 6 children dispersed around the house, playing and studying, while Teetu, who was really grouchy, stayed inside with Shanti in the kitchen. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and asked, "Hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra?" Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that Teetu was totally obsessed with. When Shanti's oldest son mentioned Agra, Teetu, who was sitting in the kitchen, suddenly looked up, completely fixated on their conversation. Then, without a word, Teetu got up, left the kitchen, went to his room, grabbed a couple of things, and came back into the kitchen carrying a bundle of clothes. He walked right past his mother and brother, went out the front door, and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this was a 3-year-old child, not a teenager, a little kid. Shanti and her oldest son watched in shock as Teetu ran off down the road, frozen in place for a moment. Then, as if breaking out of a trance, the oldest son ran out of the house to catch up with Teetu. It didn't take long for him to catch up, but surprisingly, it was difficult to stop Teetu from running away. The young boy fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. When the older brother finally got Teetu back inside, Shanti saw that her oldest son had a black eye from where Teetu had hit him. When Shanti turned to Teetu to try to get him to apologize to his brother, she saw that Teetu was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum, kicking, flailing, and screaming at the top of his lungs. Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope of calming him down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. They restrained Teetu so he couldn't hurt himself or anyone else or damage anything. For a while, Teetu continued to scream, flail, and throw a fit. Eventually, though, he began to calm down and started saying, "Sesh Verma," over and over again. Then he began talking about something new, something that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. In addition to saying Sesh Verma, Teetu also started talking about a radio store in Agra, repeatedly asking, "Why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me?" As Shanti listened, she suddenly thought, "This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to learn what's going on with my kid." Once Teetu fully stopped his tantrum, Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him. After Teetu had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and told him to go to Agra right away. She urged him to look for a radio store or anything that might be a clue to what was going on with Teetu. He was obviously fixated on the city. There had to be a reason. The oldest son left the house, went to a friend's place who had a car, and together they drove to Agra. Shanti had no idea if her son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured she had nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned, he came into the house with a very serious look on his face. Right away, Shanti could tell he had discovered something. She asked him, "What did you learn? What happened in Agra?" The oldest son looked down for a moment, then back at his mother, and said, "Tomorrow, we're going to have visitors." The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home, and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, along with 3 men, also in their 30s, dressed in suits and jackets. There was also an older couple, a man in a beautiful sweater and a woman in silk. It was clear from their appearance that these 6 people were not from the area. They were from somewhere else and had a lot of money. Shanti was inside the house watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus Teetu, had decided the night before, knowing these visitors were coming, that they wouldn't go out to talk to them. Instead, they would allow Teetu to make first contact and see what happened. When Shanti saw the group of 6 well-off people standing outside the gate, waiting to be let in, she called for Teetu and said, "Hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests." Teetu, who was not throwing a fit at this point, came running through the house. He hadn't looked outside yet. He opened the door, ran outside, and saw the 6 people on the other side of the gate. Suddenly, Shanti heard Teetu make a sound she had never heard before. It was the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these people that Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying because she knew, even before Teetu made that joyous sound, that when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard Teetu outside, yelling for her and the rest of the family to come out and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door, gestured for the guests to come inside, and led them through the house to the back deck. After they were all seated, Shanti looked over at Teetu and saw that he had a huge grin on his face. He was so happy, staring intently at the woman in the red sari who was sitting across the table from him. Teetu was just locked on her. At this point, nobody was speaking. Everyone was just sitting there. No introductions had been made, so nobody even knew each other's names. In this tense and awkward silence, Teetu, still staring at the woman in red, eventually broke the silence. The 3-year-old child asked the woman to come sit next to him. The woman in the red sari did as he asked, moving over to sit next to the toddler. Teetu looked up at her, smiled, and asked, "Do you know who I am?" The woman, looking down at him, replied, "No, I don't." Teetu looked back up at her and said, "I know who you are. You're Uma." At this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, gasped. She had no idea how this child knew her name. Before she could say anything, Teetu continued, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sonu, and I bought you those sweets?" Uma's expression changed from shock to one of sudden recognition as she looked down at Teetu, seemingly understanding what was actually going on. At the same time, Shanti, watching this happen, began piecing together what was happening. Suddenly, she realized she needed to check something. She got up, ran out of the room, and came back with scissors. Without saying anything, Shanti went straight to Teetu, pushed his head to the side to expose his right ear, and used the scissors to cut away the hair around his ear, exposing the right side of his skull. As the hair fell to the ground, revealing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching gasped. Teetu just kept smiling. To understand what had just happened on that back porch, some context is needed. When Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to investigate and look for clues that might explain what was going on with Teetu, he and his friend drove around Agra looking for radio stores or anything that might connect to Teetu. They didn't find much until they passed by one of the many radio stores in Agra. The name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and his friend. They parked their car and went inside this particular shop, where they met Uma, the woman in the red sari who Teetu had mentioned. When the older brother asked Uma how the radio shop got its name, things began to fall into place. Uma explained that the shop belonged to her husband, but he was murdered 3.5 years ago, shot and killed. Since then, she had been running the shop. Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, but couldn't bring herself to do it because the shop's name was based on her husband's name, Sesh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Sesh Verma, the 2 words Teetu had been saying all the time at the end of his tantrums. Sesh Verma, Sesh Verma. That was Uma's husband. It turned out that the details of Sesh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with Teetu's birth. All of Teetu's strange, erratic, and terrible behavior throughout his life now suddenly made sense if you knew about Sesh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, came to believe that when Sesh was murdered, his spirit somehow left his body and entered Teetu's. Essentially, Sesh was reincarnated in Teetu. This reincarnation theory explained why Teetu was always saying Sesh Verma, because, in theory, that was his real name. It also explained Teetu's obsession with Agra, where Sesh's radio shop was and where he lived. Additionally, the theory explained why Teetu was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, accusing them of being poor and living below his station. Sesh's family was very wealthy, and if his spirit was now in Teetu's body, it would make sense for him to feel at odds with their lifestyle. Lastly, the reincarnation theory explained the 2 unique and pronounced birthmarks Teetu had near his right ear, one above and one below it. Shanti had always known about these birthmarks, but after learning how Sesh Verma was killed, shot in the side of his head, with the bullet entering above his right ear and exiting below it, she ran to get the scissors to reveal Teetu's birthmarks. When the other family members saw them, they were stunned. The birthmarks were exactly where the entry and exit wounds were on Sesh. It's also worth noting that on the day Sesh was shot and killed, Shanti began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with Teetu and had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about Teetu and Sesh Verma, Shanti, her husband, and the rest of the family expected Teetu to want to live with Uma and his other family. Initially, that is what Teetu wanted, but he quickly decided that he wanted to stay with the family he was born into and just visit the other family. So, that's what they did. Uma and her family visited Teetu often, and vice versa. The families got along well. As for Teetu, he was very happy. His bad behavior basically disappeared, and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. Teetu grew up to be a happy and successful adult with a family of his own. He is currently a professor at a college in India.